Good afternoon and welcome to the Who's in the Driver's Seat webinar with Tim Hindes, CEO and co-founder of Staymetrics. My name is Keith Sayer, Marketing Specialist here at Staymetrics. Thank you everyone for joining us. To share very briefly about our speaker this afternoon, over his more than 30 years in trucking, Tim has been an owner-operator, he's been a dispatcher, and he's run a logistics firm, among many other things. These experiences provide him with a unique understanding of and perspective about the trucking industry, its leadership practices, operations, and management, and most importantly, its drivers. Today, he and co-founder Kurt Liddell lead the team at Staymetrics, bringing research and strategies to carriers looking to improve their driver retention. At this point, I'll be turning over the call to Tim to share his insights with you.
Thanks, Keith, and thank you for setting this up. Welcome, everybody, and we appreciate the opportunity to present today. Who's in the driver's seat? Give you some background as to how this presentation came to be. I've been using pieces of this presentation to speak with carriers in the industry. Many of them, some of you might have actually have seen pieces of this. Is if you've been out in the insurance industry where you've been going to see your to the insurance conferences. We've been speaking quite a bit at those, as well as some state associations. This presentation's gone over really well, and what it focuses on is really who's in the driver's seat, what's going on with the drivers out there, and what's going on with this turnover, and what's it feeling like in the market. And I'll tell you that some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to be, some of it we're going to be really comfortable with, and some of it we're going to be uncomfortable with, because we're going to point out some things in the industry that are problems, but they're problems that can be addressed. So we certainly hope that you see the value and you get value out of this. What we're going to do today is go through a little bit about who we are. We're going to talk about when drivers leave and spend a decent amount of time talking about that early turnover. And then we're going to talk about our read in workforce, not only driver workforce trends, but the general labor market as a whole and how that's affecting our industry. Getting into then why do drivers leave, right? We know when they leave, but why are they leaving? And then what can be done to keep them? We're going to get into some nuts and bolts and some things that you can do. Either if you're a client of ours, great. If you're not a client of ours, some of the things that we're going to talk about today you can still put into place. A little bit about who we are. My partner and I, 35 years in the business, we've been working together as business partners for pretty much that entire time. I'm a former driver. I came out of a truck 35 years or so ago and spent about half my time in operations and half my time in executive management. I'm a culture freak. My partner's a culture freak. We get it. In our last stint prior to Staymetrics 7 years ago, we started a brokerage operation, and we clearly understood the issues from a driver's perspective, from a carrier's perspective, and from a shipper's perspective or a broker's perspective. And it really came to mind to me that he or she has the most driver's wins at the end of this storm. And when we started looking at the driver turnover issues, I looked at some known characteristics that I see and have seen in drivers pretty much all my life. And one of them is that drivers feel like they're not being heard. That's pretty much a chronic complaint that I've heard from drivers most all my life. The second one is that drivers didn't feel recognized and rewarded for the work they did, specifically some of your best drivers and some of my best drivers, right? They would actually take offense to the fact that sometimes we focus more on the newer drivers. So I wanted to put a program and build a company that addressed both of those. So what our model is to really ask drivers' opinions. We're going to talk about that through the surveys and how we do that. But then recognize and reward drivers. So the combination of those two on the platform, I believed in my heart of hearts when I built the company that if companies could better understand their drivers and know why they stayed, why they left, and if drivers got the opportunity to give their opinion And I want to make sure that I spend some time talking about this, and those opinions are acted upon and or recognized. That's key. If that's being done while at the same time that driver's getting recognized and rewarded more than he or she's ever been in their professional career, my bet and the hypothesis is you're going to have more engaged and loyal drivers. And for those of you that are on this call that are clients of ours, you actually see that. But the reward and recognized drivers piece, I want to point out that double asterisk there. That's with an abundance mentality. What we've seen in the past, and I'm going to speak the truth here, is a lot of trinkets and trash. What we considered recognition and rewards for drivers were actually an insult, right? You know, you've been with us 10 years. Here's a small token of our appreciation, and it's just that, a small token of their appreciation. Ours in our program, you know, what we really consider is to have an abundance mentality, and that is to maybe really put a recognition and rewards program in that drivers are going to engage. This next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the life cycle approach to driver feedback. This is the survey side. And I'm going to talk about when we do surveys and why we do them in that order. But what we basically, we have four surveys that we do for our clients. And the first two, those onboarding surveys, are really key. And I want to speak to what they do. We do what we call, inside, we'll call it a 7-day and a 45-day. Don't get caught up on the 7 and 45. But what it indicates is we want that first survey to be that driver's earliest perception, maybe just when they've got out of orientation and maybe they've just hauled their first load. And what you're looking for in that first survey is that survey is designed to tell you how his experience or her experience was through that whole process, through the recruiting process, through the orientation process. Also tells you things like why they chose you, right? And how they felt about the recruiter. But another thing our surveys do in this area, and we'd suggest that you focus on, is understanding how well your recruiters are telling the story about your company. And what does that mean? How well are they telling a story about your company? How well are they discussing expectations? The second survey we do in that onboarding is at about the 45-day mark. And at the 45-day mark, now you're going to get an opportunity to see what that driver's earliest experiences with you are. And what's fascinating to me here is not only are there great opportunities to intervene with drivers that are dissatisfied, but you start to see trends. The company will start to see trends in terms of what your earliest and most impressionable drivers are most frustrated with, and it allows you to work on that. Moving over into the annual satisfaction survey, for those of you that are clients of ours today, you're going to see this is going to be modified. It's still going to be an annual, but it's going to kind of be a rolling annual. In today's environment, what I really like about this survey is, we've got many of our customers that started with us 7 years ago are still with us today. So these carriers basically have 7 years worth of data on how their drivers feel about them on basically every aspect of trucking. How do they feel about your pay package? How do they feel about your equipment? How do they feel about your culture? How do they feel about your relationship with dispatchers? So it's a very in-depth, and what's nice about that is you're able to make decisions. If I'm on your side of the fence and I have to make decisions on what kind of policies and procedures I'm going to put in for drivers, I want data, and I want to know how my drivers feel about it. The last one is exit interviews. I'm a big fan of exit interviews, but only under two pretenses. One is in exit interviews, if it's done by a third party, and if it's done in conjunction with an annual or onboarding surveys. Here's why. Exit interviews are going to help you, and they're going to provide granularity. But usually, the information you're going to get in exit interviews, 9 out of 10 times for us, it confirms a problem that we either see in the annual and or in the onboarding surveys. So that's what we suggest the market does in terms of a life cycle approach to driver feedback. But then what do you do? How do you translate that driver feedback into higher retention? This is our model. So first, I think it's important, what do they say? You want to survey your drivers' attitudes. Somebody asked me a couple weeks ago, what percentage of the fleet do you think we should get? What can you get? On your early surveys, you should get 80%. That's your earliest surveys. That's your what we call 7 and 45. On your annuals, we think you ought to be able to get 60%, and on your exits, you ought to get 50%. So your first thing is right there, survey and driver attitudes. Go out and run those surveys, and moving into what do we know. Now, what we do at StayMetrics is we're going to analyze that, and we're going to be able to run some predictive models for you. We're going to be able to run some comparative data off of communities that are similar to you, and we're going to be able to draw conclusions based upon the model that we're going to move into the next area of generating ideas for practice. And that's where we're going to engage you, the client, and we engage you on a quarterly basis. With that, this generating ideas for practice is not just us, it's you as well. And might I tell you, at this point, really, what usually happens during this part is we've got some good ideas for you, but we don't know your business as well as you know your business. Usually, when we get to this point and we're able to show you the data, 9 out of 10 times it's your management team that looks at that data and says, now I get it, I know where the problem is, it's right here, and I know what we can do to move on it. And then you're going to get into the next one, which is now we're kind of going to go behind the scenes, and the next one, acting on ideas, that's you. This is where if you're a prospective client of ours, you have to ask yourselves, are we ready? Are we ready? What does that mean? That means, are we ready? Are we staffed accordingly to be able to accept the data and to be able to put action plans in place and act on those ideas? And then the last one, of course, is what's the ideal outcome? Is you're going to keep drivers and you're going to have the right retention. Let's take a peek at some of the top industry issues that are out there. This is a survey that ATRI does. It's the American Trucking Research Institute. And they do this every year, and they ask basically what are the top issues that you senior executives, what's keeping you up at night, right? And you're telling us loud and clear that it's the driver shortage and driver retention is number 1 and number 3. So these are real issues, and they're real issues for a reason, because we're feeling the pain. We're absolutely feeling the pain, and I'm going to talk more about that in a little bit. Let's talk about, we know we have this high turnover. We know this is a big problem. When do drivers leave, right? When are they leaving? So for those of you that follow our press, there's something called the stay days table that we've developed. And if I'm you, I'm going to look at this data that we publish, and I'm going to match it against your data. So if I'm a senior level executive on this call, my action item to you would be for you to get on our subscription list for this data. When this data comes out, you want to compare it to yours. Have your in-house people start running the same models for you. Your goal is to be able to beat that 30, 60, and 90. And here's why. Because we see that. Any carriers that can beat that 30, 60, and 90, the more significant they can beat those 3 buckets, it's usually 50% better retention than their competitors. So there's a lot of opportunity there. But as you can see, the way to read this is after 30 days, if you look at the bottom, after 30 days you have 85% of drivers, basically 86% of drivers that are still with the program in 30 days. But look at 365. Look at the 365 days. Drop down to the bottom, only 38%. 38%, right? So that says a lot. I don't want to depress you, but let's say between a bunch of carriers, 100 drivers start an orientation on Monday. What this is basically saying is 35 are gone in the first 90 days. 22 are going to leave in the next 180, and by the time you get through the first year, 60% have left. It's just a tremendous amount of thrashing and waste. And really, we've identified the thrashing and waste, and I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about some of the science behind that thrashing and waste. So let's take a peek at our read on driver workforce trends, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this. I got turned on to a demographer at a Grand O'Reilly event about a year and a half ago by the name of Ken Grobach. I'm going to spell his last name for you because he's actually very fascinating, and he has tremendous insights as to what the labor market is going to look like as a whole moving forward. He's a bit of a futurist. Spelling of his last name is Grobach, and it's Kenneth Grobach. But, when I got introduced to him, it caused me to dive further into labor market research and really trying to understand where this labor market is, where it's headed. And I'm going to speak to some summations that we've had. And the first one is that we've been failing to attract younger workers, and we're paying the price. And for those of you that are old enough, you'll remember when the CDL came into play in the mid-'80s. That was really kind of the big, and it needed to come into play. I'll be the first one to admit it. But it really changed and put a barrier of entry into the model. What did that mean? That meant that now everywhere across the country you had to be 21 years of age, and now you had to go to school, and now you had to pay $6,000 to $8,000 or whatever it was to actually get your license. So it changed the barrier of entry, and it got us away from drivers that were under 21. Now, the second piece of that is that the trades are short now, but that's different from what it was. So the trades are short. So if you follow the trades and you follow what happened to the trades in 2008, they lost about 300,000 members during that time, during that downturn. And basically, they never caught up. And that's why today you're seeing most apprenticeship programs in most parts of the country are wide open. And then the next piece is fear of automation is discouraging career-minded people. So every week, I'm going to show you some headlines that come out, but every week we're putting headlines out and we're talking about driverless vehicles and automation's coming, and the number one disruptive industry expected next is trucking. So, you've got to imagine a situation where there's a career-minded person that's talking to you about, should I enter into trucking? And, our argument today would be that, yeah, it's a great industry. It's a wonderful industry. It's provided very well for me and my family all these years. But that person could ask me, hey, when is automation coming? And even if I say it's 20 years out, the argument is that person can come back and say, well, so what you're really telling me is I'm 22 years old. You're telling me I'm going to be 42 years old. Trucking is the only industry I'm going to know, and I'm going to have to relearn something else. So we've got a bit of a black eye there, and we're not helping ourselves by about every week or every other day, it seems, that there's a new piece of headline coming out. Related to that is automation. Our read is automation is coming in too slowly to offset the shortage. So at the same time that, we're kind of making more and more folks disinterested about this industry, I'm going to show you some quotes from some folks in the know in this driverless space that say we're quite a ways away from it. And then what's your best play? Obviously we're biased. Obviously we'd love to have you as a customer. But the best play is really for carriers to get laser focused on retention, right? Okay, so laser focused on retention. What's that mean? That means that in today's environment, most carriers don't have a formal retention program. 9 out of 10 carriers don't even have retention as a line item on their P&L or their budget. They just steal it from some other department. So we're really not serious about retention yet. We're starting to give it some lip service. There's some carriers that are really, really serious about it, don't get me wrong. But as a whole, as the industry, we're still giving it lip service. We're still out there checking it out, checking out the webinars and seeing what we should do. But what we would suggest, if I was a CEO of a trucking company, I see this as a survival play. survival and winning play. It's all about retention. And if our retention, if we can prove to have better retention, it's going to show that we have a better culture than anybody else. If we have the better culture, it's going to attract people. So that's our suggestion. So when we get into, fact or fiction of the driver shortage, yes, I want to clearly understand that I realize we're in a soft spot right now, or a temporary soft spot. My read is that this is a short blip in the radar. But every week we're seeing more and more headlines. We're not getting kids picked up at the school buses. The school bus industry is short as well. So it's very, very tight out there, and it's going to remain tight. Why can't we find labor like we used to? This chart here starts to get into general labor, and it tells the story, right? Is we're having a lot fewer babies than we did back in the 60s. And as a matter of fact, there's a couple statistics I want to share with you that are pretty, that Grobach shared with me, and I'm like, oh my God. And basically it was, Tim, the millennials need to do 2.1 births per female to be able to take the boomers out of the workforce. And the last census, which is 6 years old, I believe, had the millennials at 1.7, already behind. And I believe that that's going to get corrected down even more upon the next census. So what do you see? What does that mean? What are you seeing? You're seeing more and more people exiting out of the labor pool that are boomers, that are retiring, and there's not enough to backfill today. This is why you look at in markets throughout the country, fast food restaurants that can't open their front doors and have to open for a couple hours with just the drive-through because they don't have staff to open, job positions that are taking longer to fill, job positions that people can't fill. So we're already feeling it in the general labor pool. And it's the beginning signs of basically what trucking has been feeling for quite some time. If we look at the labor force participation rate by age, this actually starts to tell a story too. So first I want to point out the youngsters, the 16 to 24. They're not in the labor pool as much as they were, and they keep declining. So what the dynamic you're seeing there is, let me just go right back to my high school days, right? I'm 57 years old, and when I graduated high school, if you look at the statistics, 56% of students went to college. So I'm going to kind of put a little analogy out there. So 56 went to college. That left me 22 males, roughly 22 males in a male-dominated industry like trucking. I want to just use that for now. But 22 males to basically fight against, in the 80s, the military and the service industry and trucking. So those were basically the big three. We didn't have the trades. You couldn't get in the trades. It was hard to get in the trades. The apprenticeship programs were wide open. You had to know somebody to actually get in the apprenticeship programs in many, many parts of the world, or parts of the United States. So, but you look at it today, and I want to give you a different statistic. Today, 70%, and that's what you're seeing in this chart with the dark blue. 70% now are going to school, some other form of further education. They're not entering the workforce. So what does that mean? Instead of having 22, now I've got 15. So it's a high percentage of less, right? Well, it gets even worse because I have less, but now the market is significantly different. Now the trades are wide open, right? Okay, and the unemployment rate is at all-time historical lows. So that is what you're feeling and have been feeling when a lot of, especially smaller to mid-sized carriers that don't have their own schools are telling me, man, it is bitterly tough out there to find drivers. That's what you're living. The other piece of this story I want to share with you is let's look at the older folks. Theirs is going the opposite. What's happening there? This is quite fascinating to me. And the reason is if we remember back 10 years ago, we as an economy, we as a country, had a lot of buyouts that we were doing for our older labor force. And really the strategy was, whether it be known or unknown, was let's buy out some of this higher labor that's about to retire anyway. Let's replace it with lower cost labor. That was a strategy that was fairly common through the 80s into the early 90s. It's almost rare now, and when I speak, oftentimes I speak to groups of 300, 400 in the room, and I tell people now that we're begging people not to retire. Can you give us one more year? Can you work part-time for 6 months? Whatever it is. And I normally see people in the room point to people at the table of people that are in their companies that are trying to retire but actually can't. So it's quite a fascinating labor environment we're in. If we look at the age demographics, and again, I don't want to alarm you, but I want this to be an aha moment for you, because look at what's gone on since 1994 to 2013. And that demographic 20 to 34, it's gone from the largest to the smallest group. And look at the size of 55 and over. And I want you to think right now of your own fleet, and how many of your own fleet, your core guys that have been with you for years, how many of them are going to retire in the next 6 to 8 years? So that's what you got to be thinking of. That group is going to be gone in 6 to 8 years. And you can't do anything about that turnover. That's going to be retirement or illness, okay? So it's a real deal. Why wouldn't somebody want to choose a career as a driver? We talked about this earlier, about every week something's coming out saying, man, autonomous is coming right around the corner. But is it really? Is it really? When you start to peel back the onion, right, and you start to listen to podcasts, you start to do the research, you see stuff like this. Anthony Lewandowski, CEO, co-founder of Pronto Autonomous, he's right there in the battle of it. And he says, basically, we're finding ourselves, we as an industry are finding ourselves that guess what? We're still at the starting point, right? Last 15 years, we've mostly idled. We're just now getting started. So for those of us that are expecting autonomy to come in, right, pretty fast and take care of this, I don't think that's going to be. I think it's going to be quite the opposite. It's going to get tighter before it gets better, and it's going to take a certain type of carrier to be able to actually make it. Why do drivers leave? So I just laid out the labor market, right? And the reason drivers leave is, you bet, because they can, right? Let's face it. This is the only demographic, this meaning being a truck driver in the United States of America is the only demographic that we have in this country, the labor demographic, that has had a shortage exposed to it for more than 10 years. So all you're seeing is what happens in normal human behavior. You're seeing a labor market with no fear. These people don't have to work for you. And that's the message I need you to hear today. They don't have to work for you. We're going to suggest that you build cultures that attract drivers, but the light bulb moment in trucking companies in the United States that has to go off right about now is that as your drivers that love you, that you just had in your mind a couple minutes ago, as they decide to retire, this next set of drivers don't have to choose you. And then while we're talking about that, I want to talk about a little exercise that I do that I'm going to show you. And I do this exercise when at speaking engagements, and I did this exercise about 15 times in the last 4 months. And I asked the audience, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you agree with this statement, that people should feel lucky to have a job? And I asked them to answer verbally. And I start with, and I say that I want the demographics. Don't answer yourself yet, because I'm going to ask by demographics. So we're going to start with the Depression era. You call them traditionalists, Great Depression. These are folks that lived it. And of course, boomers are like, they're a 10, they're absolutely a 10. We understand why they're a 10. Jobs weren't plentiful. There was starvation almost, right? You were lucky to have a job. If you had a job, you did everything you could do to keep it, all right? Well, then the next demographic I want to ask you is, how about baby boomers? How would baby boomers answer this? So I tell them, there's a bunch of baby boomers in the room. Where are you guys at? And they start yelling out, 8, 9, 8, 9, right there. So, and it's really interesting because that's very frequent. And the argument is they were raised by the traditionalists who basically passed on the fear to them. And I tell people, hey, I'm a boomer. I'm a younger boomer. I'm 57 years old. But even as a younger boomer, I was 28 years old before my mother stopped calling me and asked me if my job was okay. And God forbid I tell her that, yeah, you know what, Mom, I'm thinking of dispatching for, another company. Oh, my God, you got 2 babies at home, So, baby boomers, man, I tell you what, we're right there. We kind of feel that, man, you ought to be lucky to have a job. And then I ask people about the millennials, and the boomers start yelling, 1, 3, they're on my couch, but really, there are 3. I don't want to say they get it, but look at the labor market they're in, right? There's not a shortage of opportunities for millennials. And they're not really big at fitting into the rules that maybe we would have put in place for them 30 years ago, right? Those are our rules, but it's a different market today. So then you say, well, what about the drivers? What about these drivers? Oh, my God, are you kidding me? It's unanimous. The drivers are a 1. You should feel lucky to have this job. Are you kidding me? You should feel lucky to have me. I can drive for anybody else tomorrow. So the issue that I ask people is I say, okay, what generation? And I'm going to, and if you got multiple people in the room, I'm going to ask the question, what generation is leading the majority of the trucking companies right now in the United States? And of course, it's the boomers, right? So there is a long, what I call an empathy arch, and that's a long way to go. And you hear a lot of people say, I just don't get these guys. I'll tell you a story. So I was doing a consulting gig, and we were trying to help a carrier out, and they were a boomer, third-generation boomer-led carrier, and I was going through this exercise. And before I went through the exercise, they were telling me how frustrated they are with these new drivers. Man, there's just story after story. These new drivers, they're not like the older drivers. Man, new drivers, the quality of these guys is just horrible compared to, man, I just, just really tell me the story. So I get to this chart, and before I could put that arc up, one of the owners stands up, he's 60 years old, and he points to the drivers and the millennials, and he says, let me tell you, Tim, these people repulse me. Repulse, as in get away. And I couldn't help but notice when I raised my eyes and looked out the window that there were 10 trucks sitting on the fence. I was thinking to myself, order the casket, man. You guys are done. You have to get this right. You have to understand this. And if you've got boomers in management roles today that can't understand and engage positively with millennials and this new generation of drivers, you've got to change them out. I think it's that critical. So let's get into some of the science behind the early turnover, okay? And we already talked about the fact that they can leave, but what do we know about the science and what helps them stay or not stay? So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time on now. I'm 33 minutes into this. We're going to wrap it up in about 10 minutes. Well, we're going to take you through some pretty heady stuff, but if you can grab it, it's really cool stuff. This is some work of Dr. John Mueller, PhD from the University of Minnesota. And Dr. John has been studying early turnover for 30 years. So not necessarily in trucking, right? But he's been fascinated, and his field of study is, why does somebody say they want a job and they're going to take this job, and 45 days later they leave? What is going on? So we were super excited to get introduced to him through one of our co-owners, Dr. Timothy Judge. And the first conversation I had with John Mueller, introducing him to trucking, he talked about selection and socialization, which in here is really titled pre-arrival and encounter. And he talked about it in terms of, the selection process being how you select somebody. So let me give you John's description of it. So basically, I asked John, I said, John, well, tell me what the selection process is. He said, oh my God, the selection process is your interviewing process, right? Your screening process, your second interview, your job testing that you do for qualification. And I said, John, we don't do any of that in trucking. He said, well, what do you do? I said, well, we used to do that prior to the CDL coming into place, but when CDL came into place, basically the whole industry switched to recruiters. He said, recruiters? So you're using recruiters to get majority drivers? I said, oh, yeah. And then he said, well, one of the worst things you can do is to do that model, and then the other thing is you don't have sign-on bonuses there, do you? I said, oh, yeah, we have sign-on bonuses. He said, yeah, you do that. You do recruiters sign-on bonuses, and then if you incentivize the recruiters for their head count, that's actually the worst model you could. I said, that's the model we have. So then his next piece is like, okay, well, what do you do on socialization? I said, well, you got to teach me what socialization even means. He said, man, it means when somebody comes into the company, they're brand new, what do? You know how somebody takes them to lunch, maybe the boss takes them to lunch the first day, maybe the second day where they're with the IT department and they're learning all that. Maybe they get a day or two to work in their own office at their own cubicle, and he's describing all office stuff, right? And he's like, and maybe their third week that, he has a meeting with the people that hired him in HR, and they talk about how it's going, And I said, John, we don't do any of that in trucking. We actually, they're not making money if we're not making money. So that piece is very fast. It's 2 days of orientation and, cold pizza and a video. And he's like, oh my God. And he's like, in a model like that, you'd have like 100% turnover. I'm like, we do. So we've kind of done this to ourselves, but see, we can undo this to ourselves. And we have a lot of our clients that have done this. They've put these processes back in place, and they're working quite well. So what you're seeing here is John's chart where he's basically saying that the better you do at recruitment and selection, the better you do at orientation, and the better you do in that early metamorphosis where he or she is communicating with the dispatcher and building that relationship, you're going to have outcomes that are productive drivers, committed drivers, and drivers that are going to stay. Some of the problems that you have there, though, the recruitment challenges are, accurate, inaccurate descriptions of the job. It's almost like don't ask, don't tell, right? And what I mean by that is, you have drivers that call you, let's admit it, and they say, hey, when's your next orientation? Boy, it's awful tempting, and I'm going to bet that half of the people on this call would admit, because nobody's watching, you admit, you can nod your head at in your own privacy, that your company maybe just closes that deal and tells the guy and starts to process him, and that's good. He wants to come work for us. I'm not going to question him, right? But we're not doing him a justice. We're not doing anybody justice by not having the conversation with him or her in terms of what are they expecting? What are they expecting? And have them talk first. Ask them not only what are they expecting, what are they running from? What is it that was so bad about the last carrier? Because what if you've got the same issue, right? So let them talk first, and then let them tell their expectations, and then you tell yours, right? So you want to have those conversations. Next one is missing information on pay policies. What does that really mean? That means that the recruiters really don't know what the settlements are. They know what generally pay is, but they're missing key information on what to tell drivers. And what does that mean? Let me be really granular. Is when you tell a driver a pay number, drivers can do math, and they'll do math in their head, and they'll do the division, and they know what that average number should be. And when their first 3 settlements is less than that, you blew it. You broke trust. You lied to them in their eyes, and they're going to leave you. But then I talk to carriers and they say, Tim, he left too early. I could show you right here where if he would have stayed it out, he would have finished at the right number. Well, then just tell him that on the front side. Show it to him on the front side. Does that make sense to you? Hopefully some people are nodding their heads, right? Show it to him on the front side. Show him, hey, this is what our average pay is in week 2. This is what it is in week 4. This is what it is in week 10. And then your overall recruiter relationship is very key. So this is what the selection process looks like, in the normal HR environment. And of course, this is what it looks like, this is what it looks like in ours, right, in the trucking industry. So what you're missing out is that comprehensive interview and that background examination, okay? And really that's what you want to get to. That comprehensive interview is really what I call behavioral interviewing skills that you want to put back into your organization. Orientation, great opportunity there, but it's challenges. Information overload, right? You've only got X amount of days to communicate X amount of things. So it's very, very difficult for drivers. We know that. From the thousands of surveys that we do, we get feedback that, man, I am burned out from the information I got. I'm not gathering this, fast enough. And then unclear policies, right? That's another thing in terms of, gray areas. And then paid, non-paid orientation time. So those are some big issues. But on orientation, and I want to spend a little bit of time on this, I might run a little bit over for those of you that are watching the clock. But orientation is your best opportunity to impress that driver. It's your opportunity to actually wow them. And I want you to think of your orientation and think, when was the last time you really modified it? And if it's me and my orientation looks like my neighbor's, I failed, okay? I want my orientation to be so impressive that when at first break, and you know what I'm talking about, first break we're going to go out and we're going to get a smoke out in the parking lot, pick up the phone, call home. What are we talking to home about? How is it? How do you like it? Did you pick the right company? And you have to ask yourself, what have you done in the first hour and a half of that driver's experience with your company to just wow the heck out of them? And if you haven't, it's wasted. It's just totally wasted. Look at all the money you put in to recruiting, to advertising, to get that person in, and then you waste it. You can't do that. You got to take advantage. Next one. Early driving challenges, brand new drivers, man, dispatcher relationships. We know that that's a problem, right? And I want to speak to that because let's admit it, dispatching isn't dispatching anymore, is it? What was dispatching? Look at Dan Baker's work, right? What is Dan talking about? How to build that personal relationship between a driver and how do we understand each other just as human beings, right? Well, when we pile on, when we have 50 drivers per fleet manager and 70% of the communication is electronic, we got to figure out how to get that dispatcher or somebody more face time with that driver, because I want to share with you what some new drivers say with some carriers. Some new drivers say with some carriers that it's been 2 weeks and they haven't had a verbal communication with anybody. So Dr. John Kameyer Mueller would tell you they're not socialized into your company at all. They're just driving your purple truck or your red truck or your pink truck, but they're not socialized into your company. Trainer relationships are really big. They cause turnover. We know that. And then unmet expectations, right? Because we never discussed it. So the driver's frustrated. It's not what he expected. Well, he's frustrated because it's not what he or she expected because the conversation never took place. So ongoing challenges. We see the cast of characters here. Maintenance, right? Maintenance has got to be high. Settlements, got to get them right. Work-life balance, hard stress. It's a stressful job. And health and safety. These are all things that we see that's showing up. But what can be done to keep them, okay? What can be done to keep them? Let's talk about strategies for each part of driver socialization. So what we suggest is you communicate a consistent message. What is reality? Here's how I would do it. If you're a senior exec and you're on this call and you want to fix this, get a pen. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to get 3 people in the room. You're going to get the head of your recruiting. You're going to get the head of orientation, and you're going to get your head of operations. And you're going to ask them, what is our promise to our drivers? And you're going to clarify what that is. In miles, in home time, and pay, what can they expect? That's the first thing you need to do. Second thing you're going to do is you're going to use, if you're a client of ours, you're going to use the 45-day survey, and you're going to find out on a quarterly basis what areas your drivers are they disagree with you on. They're like, hey, you told us to expect this, a brand new shiny steering wheel that had red lights on it, and I've been here and there's no brand new shiny steering wheel with red lights on it. They're going to tell you what you told them that in their eyes was an untruth. And then you have an opportunity to have that meeting again. You follow me? Here's the next step. You're going to have that meeting again, and then you're either going to correct your message or you're going to correct it, and you're actually going to execute on the promise. Now, what I'll tell you, the get out of jail free card is 9 out of 10 times you're just basically going to change the message, and that's the best thing to do. So, looking at recruiting and selection, start to put behavioral interviewing in. Ask your recruiters. Ask them, hey, you're not taking everybody, are you? Are you asking them, and what kind of questions are you asking them? Are you asking them what they're leaving? Next thing is driver matching, teams and trainers. We Stay Metrics have software that will help you match people in the same truck. And you can think of it like an eHarmony type of product. It's pretty cool. It works well. And then, think in your mind, which candidate is going to be a successful driver for you? Orientation. Here it is. I'm going to pound on this a little bit more. The quality of your orientation is entirely in your control, right? We hear from drivers all the time that they're still disappointed in orientation. We're still treating orientation the way we did in the 80s, 90s, right? And it's borderline disrespectful in many ways. So you've got a tremendous opportunity to reimagine what do I want that driver to feel like in that first hour and a half? What do I want that driver to feel like in his first week and a half? And then if you really want to get into culture, what do I want that driver to feel like in a year and a half? And really, I'm going to tell you now what it's going to feel like. It's going to feel like love, care, and consideration. Love, care, and consideration. That's what you want to show. So engage learning. Make sure you have interactive technology and e-learning tools. Develop relationships. Start that process of early check-ins and regularly. And then, and then more in orientation, pay transparency for new drivers. They'll like that. We encourage you to look at a cool case study that we did for a great client of ours, Brady Trucking. These guys are really, really innovative, and they're good partners in the industry. If you're interested in an introduction, more than happy to introduce you to these guys. They're really, really smart. They're very culturally driven, and they're great people, and they share a lot with the industry. Next slide is getting into the onboarding and early experiences. Is socializing new drivers, mentoring programs. I'm huge on them. I love them. We have a strategy at Stay Metrics that we suggest our clients put in on mentoring programs. We had a carrier put it in that it's wildly successful for. So we're a big fan of mentoring programs. Check in often. Have a plan to keep up with new drivers. Do not leave these drivers out there without somebody checking on them, right? And sincerely checking on them. And then another survey several weeks into the driving experience. By the way, on our platform, we do a lot of that check-in and that surveying for you, obviously. I'm not trying to pitch you on our company, but that is what we do. Ongoing, commitment to a driver-centered culture. So this is kind of cool. Credit where credit is due. This slide here comes from Dr. Mark Goulston, a psychologist. You might have heard of him. He wrote the book, Just Listen, How to Get Through to Just About Anybody. He's a very popular psychologist on the West Coast. He's done a great amount of work. But he said, Tim, I engage with him a lot from an advice standpoint, from a consulting standpoint. He said, Tim, if I were you, I would tell your carriers, I said, I'm listening. He said, to develop an I won the lottery culture. I said, what's that? He said that's when that driver is at the truck stop, he's at the shipper, he's at the consignee, and he can't stop talking about you. He just can't believe it. So if you believe that that's what you want to do, we'd love a phone call and that'd help you to get there. But if that's what you want to do, you're going to have to ask yourself, what do we have to stop doing? What do we have to start doing? Oh, gee, we have to stop doing this. That's not going to win the culture, right? And then focus on improving communications and ensure those drivers feel welcome at your office. If you still have a no drivers allowed past this point sign, you're stuck in the 80s. You got to get rid of that. Have a driver retention strategy and plan. Put it in a budget. Have a plan. Work a retention plan like you work your fuel plan. Work a retention plan like you work your leadership development plan. Get serious about it. Driver feedback, ongoing surveys, spot surveys, we think is smart, and then a robust recognition and rewards program. I want to leave you with this. One of our best carriers, I was talking to their CEO yesterday. This carrier has been with us for 7 years. They have a lot of companies, and each one of their companies is on with us. They have the lowest retention in their sector and have for basically the whole time. And when their owner contacted me 7 years ago, he said, I want to reward my drivers, and I want my best drivers to take their families on vacation on me every year. That's what we call an abundance mentality. But their CEO was on the phone with me this week because he said, Tim, I got to get the message out that what got us here ain't going to get us there. We got to keep innovating. Our retention plan has to get better. We have to continue to do stuff that nobody's ever heard of. He said, I was one of the first ones 15 years ago to tell a shipper that if my driver doesn't want to haul for you, I don't want to haul for you. And he said, but that's more mainstream today. But we were the leaders, and we have to continue to think of how we can build our culture that actually attracts people. And that's exciting to me. And if that's the kind of carrier you are, we'd like to work with you. Keith.
All right, thanks, Tim. So we have a couple of questions from the group. They provided in registration for us. The first one is, so say StayMetrics gets a new client and they determine, hey, their driver culture is terrible, and the company won't accept the findings. So do you consider that a lost cause, or do they eventually come around and accept the results and make changes?
Wow, that's a great question. And we've had that happen, right? Because not everybody comes to us with a great culture. I mean, I bet you, Keith, I bet you 2/3 to 3/4 come to us. We have a lot of them that have it, and they just want to kind of keep it or want us to help them get it even better. But we have an awful lot that recognize, wow, ours is a bad culture. Now, to the question of will they accept the data, if you've got a bad culture, even before you get your survey results, you're going to see that we're going to call you and say, man, we're having a hard time getting responses to a certain level. If your culture is that bad, you're going to see that your drivers aren't even going to want to answer to begin with, and they're going to need our help with our interviewers. So we're going to be able to see that culture pretty much before we even see the survey results. When we see the survey results, I would say that the majority of them, they don't push back on it. They understand that there's work to do. A lot of it is a hard pill to swallow. But we actually, we're not here to judge anybody. We know that, these companies are doing the best they can with the resources they can. But we help them identify what areas they should start with. And usually that'll work. Now, in the event a senior leader, especially the CEO, if the CEO won't believe the data, then we got a problem. Okay. Which, by the way, rarely happens.
Thanks. And another question from the group is, what is the most unexpected complaint that you've heard stated in an accident?
Well, because we're not going to go there. But isn't that one Progressive insurance commercial or something that says we've seen it, right? The elephant, walking through. So you can imagine if you've been around drivers as long as you've been around drivers, and if we've got 100,000 exit interviews, you can imagine there's some very animated ones in there, huh? So go ahead.
So is there a good predictable data point indicating whether or not a driver will stay prior to being hired?
Is there a good predictable data point? Okay, so this is like is there like a screening product that can tell you whether a driver is going to stay with your company or not? And the answer is no. But I'm going to give you the background why. For those of you who've been following us for many years, we started a research project, and basically it went 4.5 years. And Dr. Timothy Judge, Mike Krant, and about 5 or 6 other IO psychologists had a play in it. And it initially looked like there was a there, right, that there was something. We found some characteristics. But we had to run the study again out in the field to be able to publish it in academic journals, and it failed in the field testing. So the answer is no. There's no science out there that says that currently you can screen somebody. We can screen somebody as a match for another driver, as a match for a trainer, but a match specifically to your company and specifically to the industry, predicting they're going to stay. The science says no, not possible.
Is there a trend of drivers giving up their authority to join for-hire fleets as the spot freight rates have dropped?
Interesting question. Wow. So read it to me again?
Yeah, so is there a trend of drivers giving up their authority to join for-hire fleets as spot freight rates have dropped?
Yeah, so it's the reverse of what was happening 15, 18 months ago, right? So 15, 18 months ago, we had drivers leaving as company drivers, buying equipment, and playing out in the spot market off the broker board. And the answer is I don't know. I haven't seen it yet. I haven't heard carriers talk about it yet. It makes sense. The data might be right under our nose, but we haven't studied it. That's a good one for us to look into.
All right, thanks, Tim. That's all the questions we have time for today. Thanks, everyone, for joining the webinar. We hope that it was value to you. And if we can help you anyway, we've got the contact information up there on the screen now. Feel free to reach out or contact us on the website. This webinar has been recorded, and you'll get a follow-up email with a link so you can review it if you wish. We hope you will plan to join us in future webinars that we put on. So make sure you're on our online newsletter list and follow us on social media to get notified when those are being planned. And we do hope you have a great Friday and a wonderful weekend.